Okay, welcome back to this Global Health YouTube channel. We're going to be talking about literature review, and actually I'm going to do a couple of videos on lit review with, and the handsome fellow you can see on the screen there is Kevin, and I'm going to introduce you to him in just a second. We're talking about lit review. Many of you, if you're doing an MPH or you're studying or you're doing research or you're doing a PhD, or maybe you're a professional researcher, lit review is just part and parcel of your life. It's where the best evidence is. It's something we have to do again and again and again throughout your professional life in public health. Now, one of the things about lit review that's often difficult is how to start. Okay. And I have found this to be so difficult. So we're going to be talking about that today. But before we do, just quickly, Kevin, you're most welcome. Quickly tell us about yourself. Who are you? What are you doing? What's the lowdown? What's the word on the street?
Thanks, Greg. And yeah, the lowdown on me, I am both a researcher and an entrepreneur. So I've been working in medicine for about 8 years. I started out helping doctors and companies write papers. That was basically my job right out of college. And from there, we grew out a team of, I'd say, like best in class researchers focused on stroke therapies. I then turned around and developed a stroke device. So I've actually driven a stroke device from prototype through to
Wow.
commercialization. And then, so I've sort of seen this from the research angle, from the commercialization angle, and now, and how you met me, I'm the CEO and founder of Nested Knowledge, a technology company dedicated to the systematic review process.
Yeah, and I absolutely love Nested Knowledge. And by the way, they sponsor this channel, and I'm gonna, in a few minutes' time, I'm gonna get Kevin to. Yeah, I nearly said Keith, and then I said it's not Keith, it's Kevin. They're brothers, by the way. Kevin and Keith. You're going to see him on the channel as well. You have, in fact, before. Uh, I'm gonna ask Kevin to tell us a little bit about Nested Knowledge in a minute. But let's just start by getting into. People would have heard of Pico, right? And they would have heard of the. And a lot of us will have struggled with the how do I start a literature review? The beginning part is like my question, and I've always found that the most difficult part of a lit review. I also know that if you get the question right, everything after that is plain sailing. So I don't know, Kevin, can you just give us a little bit of good advice? Literature review, question, Pico, when do I do literature review? Just teach us, teach me. I need to know.
Yeah, first let's scope this down. So we're talking Pico, which means we're talking about clinical reviews. So reviews where there was a group of patients. So P is usually population or patient population.
Mm-hmm.
There are interventions and comparators. So you treated the patients with, say, placebo and then a drug, or placebo and then a device, or two devices. And then you track their outcomes. And the outcomes are what you actually want to compare interventions and comparators based on. So I'll even go into an example of this in a second. But as you say, I just want to repeat back at you a very important thing you said. If your research question is crafted correctly, you're going to have smooth sailing going forward. If you craft a research question that doesn't, number one, contain your PICOs, and number two, set you up with a concrete path forward, it's going to be it's going to be a slog, because usually what I find in those cases are people can't find any studies to put in their review, or they find thousands of studies and they can't even
Yeah.
get through the screening process, and they have to give up on their review before they've even
Oh
gotten to
my
the studies themselves.
Oh my God, have I been down that road where you do a search and you got like 140,000 papers that your search finds, and you're sort of thinking, well, who's got the time in the day to even filter through those, even if you're just doing like titles and abstracts, it's just not possible. And I've always known the problem always comes from a badly designed research question. Always, so could you go through Pico again? Just the P, the I, the C, and the
Yeah.
O.
Okay, Greg, can you see my screen?
I can. Very good. Good to go.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is from the systematic review course that I've created and that you've been so helpful in putting up on Learn More 365. And it starts with research question. And I think that people will often jump in and say, how do I draft my systematic review? And I always tell them, okay, the first step is not how, it's when am I ready to review? And
Okay.
so I don't think you're ready to review until you have a medical research question, and
Uh-huh.
that research question can be phrased in terms of your PICOs.
Yes.
And I think this is a totally standard template that you can use in any clinical discipline.
Mhm.
For population P,
Mhm.
how does intervention I perform
Mhm.
as measured by outcome O?
Mhm.
And if you want to make it more complicated, you can say for population P, how do interventions I1, I2, I3 compare to placebo or similar? But you can see that structure, right? You should
Right.
frame your research question as, for a group, how do interventions compare
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
respect to outcomes? And that sort of tells you a good concrete research question will identify who's being studied, how they're being treated, and what you're tracking about them.
Mm. And interestingly, sorry to interrupt you there, Kevin, but this same structure would work for a public health question as well. So when we're talking about medical research questions, absolutely applicable in the public health space, thinking about a population, thinking about public health interventions, thinking about outcomes, it all still works in my world as you're describing it.
I actually think that anytime you have PICOs and anytime there's published literature, you can do a review. So you can even treat your research question as a qualifier to do a review, right? So if you can frame your question in terms of PICOs that you are extracting from the published literature, then you're ready to review.
And so just to be clear, we talk about Pico, but in your PIO, you don't have the C. The C is the comparator. So if there was more than one intervention, or you were comparing it to no intervention, that would be the C.
Yes. So I actually, and in our software, we have some automatic Pico extraction. But really, if we generalize the idea of an intervention and a comparator, they're both really interventions. One of them is just the one you care more about, and that's the I, and then the C is
Right.
what you're comparing it against. So
Yeah.
I and C are more interchangeable, and I've even seen people call it PIO, and that sounds a little worse. So I say Pico, but interventions and comparators are comparable.
Okay, I got you. That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yes, of course. And so basically, if you have a question that can be framed in terms of population and interventions and outcomes, and you're combining and comparing studies to do so, then you are all good. For instance, you could say for population of COVID patients, those who got vaccines, how did those vaccines perform with respect to adverse events?
Yeah.
Though I will actually be using an example for the rest of this from my own discipline, where we'll go over Pico, and I'll show you exactly how I built out the Pico for a recent review that we published.
Okay, good stuff.
Yeah, and so I can go much more into the methods of this, but I just want to zoom out and say, if you're starting your review, start from your research question framed simply in terms of for population P, how do interventions I and C compare with respect to O outcomes? And the first step of your actual review is going to be taken directly from that. You can even think of your study design as just building out how your research question will be answered. And you can see from my slides here that the first thing you're going to do is draft a search strategy based on that. So the place that you can stumble over your first hurdle is translating your research question into a good search strategy.
Right. Okay, and I think that's the thing that it makes everybody nervous, is finding a search strategy that works, that finds the right number of papers, where the papers that you find are actually relevant to the search that you're doing.
It's absolutely and I always frame this in terms of your search strategy should be bringing back as many relevant articles as possible, but as few others as possible as well. And I've gotten the question so many times, and we try to put this in our materials, but I always get heart palpitations when I see people who have like 3,000 study searches. And so I'm just going to throw some rules of thumb out there for any novice reviewers. I would say your first search does not need to be the most comprehensive search in the world, especially if you're using nested knowledge. We take a sort of updatable living approach to review, where you can start with a search that only brings back, my recommendation is usually 200 records or fewer. You review those, you can include and exclude, and then you can adjust your search strategy. Now, I know that different institutions have different practices there, but that's my strong personal recommendation, that if you want to be successful in this, you want to make sure that you're bringing back relevant records before you set yourself up with too many thousands of records to review.
Okay, that's quite an interesting idea. And actually, that's a strategy that I have never employed. So this is the first time that I've ever been given that advice. And I've been around the houses, by the way, on Lit Review. And in actual fact, I've even got a course that I created on how to do a Lit Review that's on Learn More 365. So it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I've never, ever been given that piece of advice. And it's actually a good idea, because as I think about it, I'm thinking you do a search strategy, it finds a few papers, you work through those papers, and suddenly you start refining what your inclusion and exclusion criteria should be, because you're actually doing it. You start realizing that the population you're looking at is too big or too small. You refine that. So you go through the motions, and suddenly your actual research question itself can be something you revisit based on what you've seen. And then you're good to go.
Now you're bringing up some, let's just say this is the sausage that no one wants to talk about. And I think that even my rule of thumb is probably a little controversial. I think there's some reviewers out there who would say you need to draft your comprehensive research strategy without looking at the underlying records. Otherwise, you're not using sort of a structured a priori approach, right? A lot of people say you need to have a search strategy and then execute it. Otherwise, you're not executing on basically a prospectively planned study. But reviewing to me is an activity where you should be trying your very best to find relevant records. And as long as you keep a good audit trail, which again, we do automatically in our software, and this is probably why others haven't done it this way. As long as you keep a good audit trail of what you searched, what you brought back, what you did with those records, I don't think there's any problem with revising your strategy as you go. In fact, as you say, it reflects the imperfection of search strategy. Even if you're just searching in PubMed, there are 30 million articles on PubMed. And if you can narrow 30 million down to the 0.0001% that you need with a perfectly crafted search strategy from the start, then you don't need to do what I said. But for the rest of us mortals, I find that sort of try and revise and living editable approach is really how you get to find all of the best articles.
And really, like, that approach really is consistent with the principle of research, where you're really making an effort to do a better job. It's different from a researcher that's undertaking research. Let's say it's not literature review, you're doing any other kind of research, and halfway through the process revises their methodology so as to better come to a conclusion that they wanted in the first place. This is a very different process, whereby in the early stages, you start slowly and make sure that what you're doing works in terms of identifying the right population, the right interventions, and the right outcomes that are meaningful, and you're able to find the papers that can reflect that knowledge set in the literature. So I think what you've just described actually to me is, in any research I do going forwards in terms of lit review, I will definitely be doing what you've just said.
Absolutely. And just to jump in and give you a concrete example of this. So as I said, I designed stroke devices for a living before nested knowledge. And there's a lot of research in stroke right now about a therapy called thrombectomy. And that's a replacement for drug therapies. Before about 2015, people were treating strokes with clot-busting drugs. Mm-hmm. And in 2015, there were these 5 major RCTs that proved that you could actually use a minimally invasive device. You snake it through someone's femoral artery all the way up to their brain, and you pull a clot out. It's a really cool process. It's an endovascular technique. But people have mostly been using that for strokes in the front half of your brain, the anterior strokes. And now there's a ton of interesting research questions, and even several publications recently in the New England Journal about basilar artery strokes, which are the worst kind of stroke. And I'll actually jump in and show this from my slide deck again. But basilar artery strokes are strokes effectively of your brainstem, which means that they result in extremely high morbidity and mortality. Let me share this, and I'll show you my basilar artery example. Sorry, we got to click through methods. Though you can steal these from the course now. We're showing them. After your search, you're going to be filtering records. You're going to be extracting data. But for basilar artery strokes, they are a type of clot that is in the basilar artery in your posterior circulation, coming up your neck right into your brainstem. And they are the most neurologically harmful type of stroke. Even with treatment, mortality can be as high as 45%. And serious neurological deficit for most of the remaining patients. And this is actually a published review. And actually, let me show. This is your basilar artery right there. It comes, your vertebral arteries come together, form your basilar artery, and that feeds your brainstem. I was working with some Stanford physicians, and actually we have a case study published on our website where you can find their work on this review and their thoughts on our search strategy and our technology. But when we were looking at this, we said, okay, we have our P, right? If we take our P for basilar artery, it's going to be patients with a stroke of their basilar artery. And so we can basically start building our search strategy directly from that. We want acute ischemic strokes of the basilar artery. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as effectively reflecting your Picos in a Boolean query. And by Boolean, I simply mean you're using parentheses, quotation marks, and ors and nots.
And ors and nots.
Yep, to structure the concepts. And so for basilar artery, quite simple. We say there's a stroke and it's in the basilar artery, one of the simpler Ps that we can try to search for. And then for our starter therapy, for our starter query, I can note that the therapy that we care about is thrombectomy. Now, that may have synonyms, and I think a big part of your search strategy is going to be finding different synonyms for your terms of interest. But you can always start with just one that you know. And then, of course, this is compared to clot-busting drugs or thrombolysis. Yeah. And then for outcomes, I can map out outcomes that I might care about. We noted on the previous slide that people like to track mortality and neurological outcome. So we can search for mortality and neurological outcome. And your starter search strategy can be as simple as that. Take your research question, and if it's structured in Picos, it turns itself into a search query by just attaching those parentheses, ands, ors, and nots.
Right, that's very interesting. And then off the back of what you get from that search strategy, you might actually discover that your question was too broad. for example, you might discover that there's just so much literature, and you're hitting like the kind of 200,000 papers. And actually, the only way you can do anything meaningful is to be a little bit more focused and think more carefully about what the question needs to be if you're going to come up with some sort of reasonable or meaningful answer down the line.
Let's think about expanding and contracting in a second, but I will also note you do want to add in those synonyms, and I put one here. Synonyms are always going to be helpful especially in drilling down on papers you might otherwise miss. But let's talk about expanding and contracting reviews. I said that Boolean structures have ands and ors and nots. You use those to expand or contract your query. So you can probably see that if you add an and to a phrase, then that's going to be more constricting, right? So if I have acute ischemic stroke and I add and basilar artery, that means I'm going to get fewer results.
Both criteria have to be met in order for that particular paper to be accepted in the cohort of papers that you're going to find. Yeah.
Correct. And knots actually limit as well. So if you say not your middle cerebral artery, then that would, of course, limit even further by saying, don't give me this type of article. I even find that it's really helpful often to add some knots from the start, like say not before a certain date, not a certain study type.
Yes.
If you can find any of those, because then you don't end up having to review like editorials when you're screening. if you just eliminate them with some good knots. And then if you want to expand things, that's where you're going to be adding those ors. So synonyms or even other therapies that might be comparable, right? If there's a third therapy that can be compared to thrombectomy and thrombolysis, if we add ors, that of course expands how many results are going to come back.
And of course, if you're doing this in PubMed, you can use mesh terms, which are a great way to kind of just, and we won't talk about mesh terms today because I think there's a whole, that's a whole like 20-minute conversation, but there are ways that you can really kind of use technology like mesh terms to identify the synonyms that you might not have otherwise thought of.
If you don't want to get too far into mesh terms, and just for those who aren't PubMed librarians, mesh is basically a structured vocabulary that PubMed uses to map between synonyms. You don't necessarily need to learn them. I just jumped over from my slide deck to our software where I actually build searches. This is our search exploration tool where you can add these terms without having to know Boolean query structure yourself.
That's kind of nice.
And so you can see up here, all I did was I added, basilar artery and stroke. If I wanted instead of stroke to put, say, acute ischemic stroke as we had, then I can just add that there as a population term. And by grouping this, I'm making it an or phrase. But anyway, I can make that phrase, I can hide this, and we will actually map those mesh terms for you in the software, as well as recommending those synonyms that I was talking about. So here you can see there's actually a mesh definition for one of our outcomes of interest, right? I said that we care a lot about mortality. So if I click on mortality, it's going to populate the mesh definition here and show me all of the synonyms that those librarians have mapped. So I don't have to do that work myself. Anytime I just select it. By the way, this is our AI called Pico. Obviously very relevant to the Pico discussion. What it does is it extracts the P, I, and O, or the P, I, C, and O from underlying articles from any preliminary search. So I just ran a quick preliminary search for basilar artery, acute ischemic stroke, and thrombectomy, and it brought back the P, I, and O from underlying articles. So now I can say, oh, I should have added endovascular therapy as a synonym for thrombectomy. And all I need to do is click on it and then say add, and it will pop into the interventions.
Wow.
But back to mesh really quickly. Mesh is just there to help you automatically map onto similar concepts without having to know the synonyms yourself. And so some of that will be automatic. PubMed does this great background task called automatic term mapping for you. And if you could work through nested knowledge, it does it as well. But you should make sure you're bringing the right synonyms to the table too, because mortality is pretty well understood. But if we're talking about functional outcome, there's probably a scale. That scale probably has a specific name. I should do some independent research and figure out the synonyms for my more, let's say, discipline-specific terms before I move forward and build a query off of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And actually, so that people know, Nested Knowledge, Nested Knowledge sponsored my channel, so I've got a lovely relationship with them. I've been using Nested Knowledge for literature reviews that I've done, and the nice thing about it is you can collaborate with your colleagues. There's a lot that's nice about it. Let me tell you what, we can talk about this for days, but you can use this platform to build a lit review with your colleagues. You can kind of have multiple people contributing not only to the search and the screening, et cetera, but even to the writing, so that you can ultimately land up with an online living document. And it does so much. It'll do your, if you're doing a meta-analysis, it'll actually create the forest plots for you. It does, the prism diagrams that like illustrate, I won't get into too much of it right now. Click on the link below this video, check them out. Absolutely love them. Definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, not to turn this into too much of a demo of the software, but once you get those Pico in the software, you're going to build that out into your own hierarchy. So unlike the mesh hierarchy that librarians build, it has, tens of thousands of terms that are probably relevant to your review. You can actually focus in on the ones that are actually going to be extracted by you. So this is a sunburst diagram showing those concepts, the P, I, and O, that we cared about in this underlying review. And by going through the nested knowledge process, we were actually able to extract each of them from underlying articles. And here you can see a pre-filtered insight about a trend where endovascular therapy seemed, as of the publication of this review, to improve neurological outcome. So just by building out that review, by putting our P, I, and O into not only the search, but also into the structure of our review, we're able to answer questions about our P, I, and O, even at the statistical level, as you were noting. If we jump over, we could even run a quick network meta-analysis and find, for instance, what the rates of mortality are between medical therapy and thrombectomy. We get a forest plot, and we can see how they perform against each other. And I did highlight briefly the collaborative features back on the other side. But on top of collaboration, there's also updateability. So I mentioned earlier in the show that basilar artery stroke papers were actually published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. And we took this review. So we had an existing review. It had 3 studies, and there was a trend toward neurological improvement. As soon as the New England Journal published those 2 new articles, we were able to create a live update. And it took us only 4 days to go from New England Journal publication to our submitted systematic review of the new evidence that actually proved out what we found. So we just saw those forest plots for mortality with only those 3 initial studies. But if we go back in, we can actually see that the new studies had similar trends where endovascular therapy was way better than the drug therapy and brought our possible trend into a statistically significant better thrombectomy.
Kevin, how is it possible that you've managed to make lit review into something that's exciting? Like most people see lit review as like a necessary evil, something they've got to do.
Yeah,
oh my God, I've got to do a lit review. And suddenly when you talk about it, it's like, oh my goodness, this is like the most exciting thing ever. It's quite remarkable. I'm amazed.
Well, you and I are biased because we are both very passionate about like good research methodologies. But for me, it's about the updatability and the collaboration.
That's amazing.
Yeah. You can work with your team, and it's not going to be a slog, right? Like I did some research when we founded NK, and I saw that the average review takes 18 months to complete, and that's just not going to move science forward, right? That we're not going to be able to review every topic of interest if it takes us 18 months per review.
No.
So for me, I get excited when we can say, okay, there's a publication in the New England Journal. Let's turn around. Let's combine it with all available evidence, and let's get that out there while it's still hot, right? Because we don't want everyone to have to wait 18 months on tenterhooks to see if the New England Journal results changed the total view on this.
What's remarkable when you say like it takes 18 months to do a lit review, and I think that's true. I think I've heard that number as well. Moderna created the first version of the COVID-19 vaccine within 48 hours of receiving the RNA sequence from China. So they can create a vaccine within 48 hours. Obviously, it takes longer to get it over the line and in the pub, but that's how long it took them to make the first vaccine. And like a lit review takes 18 months. No, there's got to be a better way.
Just so that they have to do something way more complex than we do, right? We just have to define a research question and analyze their work. But for some reason, the idea of combining data points through a software has taken a lot longer than the idea of targeting a therapy specifically at a new disease state. So I think that really highlights which part of medicine is ahead and which part needs to catch up.
Yeah, indeed. Listen, Kevin, what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest let's end there. Kevin and myself have put together a cheat sheet, right? This cheat sheet is literally, if you're going to start a lit review and you're not sure what to do and what steps to take and how to do it, cheat sheet is like, you want this cheat sheet. It's going to help you. If you go through the cheat sheet, you're going to know for sure you haven't left out an important step in the process of doing a lit review. Okay. So if you're watching this on YouTube, there's going to be you're going to see a card come up on the screen at the end of the video. Click on the card. That's going to take you to a website, and you'll be able to download the cheat sheet. You're going to love it. Otherwise, click on the link in the description below. You can go to the cheat sheet right there. Get the cheat sheet. You're going to love it. Kevin, thank you very much for your time. I love this. I learned a lot, and I've been into and interested in lit review for years. And like in the last half an hour, I've learned buckets. So
Just
thanks very
wait for the
much.
next live stream where we go into, the tagging hierarchies where you get to build out your own ideas. You're gonna be floored.
Yeah, I know. I can't wait. And literally, like, kind of part of the reason why I wanted to have these conversations with you is, okay, I want to get them onto YouTube and like let my community kind of learn this. But I'm learning. This is me. I'm like literally, if like no one else was watching this, I'd be delighted to be here and have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. And you or anyone else, we at Nested Knowledge, we're researchers at heart, right? We have a technology out there. We hope people use it. We're really excited about it. But if you have a
Yeah.
research question and you're looking for help on this, not only go to the cheat sheet, but we have a support group, not for your woes, right? But for actually assisting you with building out your research questions. So if you sign up for a Nested Knowledge account and hit the support link, we can even help you with building out your Pico because we
Yeah,
know
great.
it's really challenging. And if you do it right, you're on a good track. If not, you're going to be in that 18-month category.
Yeah, you're going to be. Listen, it's been really good connecting, and I appreciate it. And we're going to connect in again soon. So this is not the last you're going to see of Kevin. Okay,
Thanks so
that,
much, Greg.
take care, everybody. Don't do drugs. Always do your best. Don't ever change. Cheers.